Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video what I'm going to do is give an overview of 10 popular Christian theodicies given by Christian thinkers over the past 2,000 years. Now, theodicy is a logical explanation for why an all-good and powerful God would allow evil. This makes a theodicy often a response to the problem of evil, which claims there is some incompatibility between the following four premises. 1. God exists and is omnipotent or all-powerful. 2. God exists and is omnibenevolent or all-good. 3. God exists and is omniscient or all-knowing. And lastly, evil exists. One of the things we need to be careful of is defining evil. It's important we need to be precise about what evil is, because if we equivocate the word evil, we can make the problem of evil seem more or less significant than it is. And here are a few definitions that are often used. One is that evil is just human suffering. This is like human utilitarianism from somebody like Bentham. You also have evil just being suffering, period, which includes human suffering along with animal suffering. This is a Peter Singer utilitarianism type of view. Another is evil is just simply that which goes against God's commands. This is divine command theory. Evil being defined in terms of teleology, or what ought not to be, following Thomas Aquinas, Alistair MacIntyre. You have evil as a lack of good, denying that evil exists as its own thing. Evil being an illusion, which you could basically say everything is all good all the time, or you can basically be an emotivist and say evil is just our personal tastes of things we don't like, with this last view being incompatible with Orthodox Christianity because it denies that sin exists. Now, one thing to point out is evil and suffering are not the same. Even though they may overlap in many cases, such as torture, rape, slavery, and murder, there are some examples of things that are evil that don't cause suffering and things that cause suffering that are not evil. For instance, somebody who has an affair and they don't feel any remorse, they have a great time, their partner never finds out, well, this is still going to be evil, Christians are going to say, even though it doesn't cause any actual suffering. On the other hand, consider going to the gym. I guess there are some people who really like going to the gym. For most of us, it involves some degree of suffering, but it would be strange to call it evil, especially if this suffering is necessary for us to get stronger. Now, the first theodicy we're going to talk about is Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. Plantinga, taking ideas from St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, states that there's no explicit contradiction between an all-good, all-powerful God existing and evil existing. So the atheist must be assuming some additional hidden premises that bring out the contradiction. These may include 3, if God is omnipotent, he can create any world he desires, and 4, if God is omnibenevolent, he prefers a world without evil to one with evil. Now, God can create any world he desires because he's omnipotent, but he prefers one in which people freely choose him, which results in a much greater good than us being pure robots. Now, following Aquinas, God cannot do anything logically impossible like create a square circle or create a married bachelor, because being consistent is part of God's nature. So as a result, God cannot force someone to freely do something. So in such a world where people can freely choose God, which is a better world, they can also choose evil, and evil exists as an act of freely choosing to go against God, not towards him. As a result, God is not ultimately responsible for evil because it is due to human choices, although I guess you could argue God is indirectly responsible for giving humans free will. Now, this works for moral evil, but what about natural evil like natural disasters, if we even say these are evil to begin with? Well, Plantinga has a response to this too. Natural disasters could be the result of spirits, demons, or wizards abusing their free will. Now, this may sound ad hoc and ridiculous. Remember that the claim is the existence of God and evil is logically impossible, not improbable. The point of this defense is to say that the atheist has not done enough work to show where the logical contradiction between God's existence and evil is, and there could be many explanations as to why an all-good God permits evil. A majority of professional philosophers do believe that Plantinga's free will defense solves a logical problem of evil. For instance, philosopher Robert Adams says, quote, "It is fair to say that Plantinga has solved the problem. That is, he has argued convincingly for the consistency of God and evil. However, there are a few notable dissenters, such as Weisberger and Graham Oppy saying, quote, "Many philosophers seem to suppose that Plantinga's free will defense utterly demolishes the kinds of logical arguments from evil developed by Mackey, but I am not sure this is a correct assessment of the current state of play. Regardless, the evidential or probabilistic version of the problem of evil is still hotly debated." The next theodicy we're going to talk about is the Augustinian Theodicy, articulated by John Hick, but inspired by and named after the 4th century philosopher and theologian St. Augustine of Hippo. This theodicy explains that evil exists not in the way good does, but just simply as an absence of good. In the words of St. Augustine, quote, "Evil has no positive nature, but the loss of good has received the name evil." In other words, evil exists relative to good the same way cold is the absence of heat or darkness is the absence of light. To better understand this idea, consider a point in 2D space. You can imagine this kind of like your house on a map that goes out in all directions. Now the point, your house, is like good. While the closest point to your house obviously exists because it is your house itself, no analogous point exists in space that represents the furthest or opposite point of your house. Instead, there's only closer to or further away from this point, which is your house. This is how Augustine would define evil, in terms of distance from the good rather than a destination in and of itself. This is especially interesting because Augustine was a convert from a religion called Manichaeism, which saw the world in this kind of struggle between good and evil, which both existed in their positive form. The Augustinian Theodicy seeks to explain evil's existence with both God's good nature and the contingency of everything on God's creation. And because of free will, we are the ones that can choose to go towards God or move away from God. Next theodicy we're going to talk about is the original sin theodicy. This theodicy, drawing from Augustine as well as John Calvin and Martin Luther, states that evil entered into the world given the fall. In other words, the reason evil exists is a result of the choices in Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. God, being a just God, allows humans to suffer the consequences of their sins, including its corrupting effect on human beings. With that being said, God provides a path to reconciliation through the death of Jesus. One key question that comes up is whether Darwinian evolution causes problems for an original sin theodicy. This is because, according to evolutionary biology, it appears that death and decay existed before humans did. One common response is that this death referred to in Genesis refers to a spiritual death, not a biological one, and this argument kind of rests on an assumption that death isn't really bad or even evil. Some theologians even remarking that God has no problem using death for purposes of a greater good, such as with the death of Jesus. For instance, even Augustine's view in the 3rd and 4th century of the Genesis account was not of 6 consecutive 24-hour days. Augustine thought that God imbued the created world with potentiality that over time would grow into the biological diversity we see today. Note that this wasn't any sort of theory of evolution like Darwin came up with, but it was a sort of front-loading of creation and its fruition over time. The original sin theodicy is often combined with Augustine's theodicy to claim that what we deem as evil is simply a lack of good, and our nature to go against the good comes from Adam and Eve's sin. The next theodicy we're going to talk about is the Leibnizian best of all worlds theodicy. Leibniz, famous for co-discovering calculus along with Newton, is also famous for his theodicy in modal metaphysics, which are actually really closely related. Leibniz starts by noticing there are many ways the world could have been. If God exists and created the world, he had to decide which of the possible worlds he would bring about. God, being all good and all powerful, thus created the best of all possible worlds. To Leibniz, if there was a better world God could have created, God would have created this world because he is all good. And because he is all powerful, he can create any such world he desires. Put another way, would God really be the greatest being if he did not create the best of all possible worlds? Now, some scholars, such as Voltaire, have criticized Leibniz's optimism in saying this world is truly the best. However, Voltaire misunderstood what Leibniz meant by this world being the best. First, Leibniz's claim is that the world is the best metaphysically, not just morally. Furthermore, Leibniz himself thought God had many other goals, and simply maximizing the happiness of human creatures in a sort of utilitarian sense was only one of them. He says, quote, "The happiness of rational creatures is one of the aims God has in view, but it is not his whole aim nor even his ultimate aim." Leibniz claims God had many constraints when building the world, and none of the worlds in which God created could be free of evil or suffering. As the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy states, quote, "Rather than maximizing one feature of a world, which would be impossible, Leibniz reasons that God must optimize the competing criteria of richness of phenomena, simplicity of laws, and abundance of creatures." This is similar to a large linear programming problem where the optimal solution exists within a set of many constraints, like George Danzig's work. Such a mathematical and optimization-based take on the world would make a lot of sense, given Leibniz's interest in and contributions to mathematics. Similarly, we have the natural law theodicy, which says that God allows suffering as a consequence of a world governed by simple, predictable natural laws. Following Leibniz, it states that a world governed by predictable laws is metaphysically better because it is more beautiful and simple than one in which basically we can't predict where it's going to happen. Claims that God allows some suffering as part of the world's normal operation according to scientific rules, and that in such a world, all things considered, this is a better one than if God is always intervening to stop suffering. Some argue, for instance, a better world would be one where I feel no pain when I stub my toe. But someone following the natural law theodicy would respond by saying God allows us to feel pain when we stub our toe because this allows us to learn the way the world works and keeps us out of future danger. Being able to predict how the natural world functions allows us to recognize patterns required to build and design stuff. This allows science and engineering to work. As a result, God does not intervene in the natural order except perhaps in special circumstances because our ability to do science and engineering and the beauty in such a predictable world is a greater good than an unpredictable one. Still, hurricanes and tsunamis do happen, and we wish to know whether God could have good reasons for allowing such natural disasters. Some skeptics, for instance, argue that God could have created a better world where there were no extreme weather patterns that caused death. Someone following the natural law theodicy may respond that these natural disasters are not really evil. While they may cause suffering and death, in many cases they are also a critical or necessary part of the ecosystem. Those following the natural law theodicy may also invoke the free will theodicy to point out how the suffering caused by natural disasters is often greatly magnified by human actions. Take the 2010 Haitian earthquake, for example, which is estimated to have killed over 100,000 people. As Reverend Doug Chaplin explains, the earthquake was caused by tectonic plates colliding. However, the catastrophe was caused by the earthquake happening in a poverty-stricken, overcrowded country with a long history of imperialism and governmental corruption. Arguably, human action and inaction were far more responsible for the severe loss of life than the laws of nature. Moving on, we're going to talk about skeptical theism, which is best summarized as responding, God works in mysterious ways to the problem of evil. For the skeptical theist, this is not meant to be a cop-out. Rather, it is to call attention to our limited understanding and lack of omniscience. To better understand skeptical theism, first note that not all suffering or badness is evil. For instance, if we choose to vaccinate our child, we may allow them to experience some pain when the vaccine is administered to allow for a greater good or a greater reduction of suffering in the future. Skeptical theism sees us in a similar position to the child discussed, who may not understand the pain associated with the vaccine is necessary to bring about a greater good in the future. As a result, it is hardly evil for someone to vaccinate their child because it causes them a short amount of pain, especially if this immunizes them to later suffering. The problem of evil requires that the evil in question is truly gratuitous or serves no greater purpose, since the theist may grant that some amount of evil or suffering promotes growth or the possibility of future growth. Theists wanting to avoid the problem of evil often say that every instance of apparent evil actually serves some greater purpose, a claim they bear the burden of proof for. However, when an atheist or anti-theist finds an example of evil they believe is gratuitous, they bear the burden of proof for showing that this evil is truly gratuitous. Skeptical theism is skeptical of our ability to say any apparent evil is truly gratuitous, given the fact that we do not have all relevant details in the way God would. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, quote, skeptical theism is the view that God exists, but that we should be skeptical of our ability to discern God's reasons for acting or refraining from acting in any particular instance. In particular, says the skeptical theist, we should not grant that our inability to think of a good reason for doing or allowing something is indicative of whether or not God might have a good reason for doing or allowing something. If there is a God, he knows much more than we do about the relevant facts, and thus it would not be surprising at all if he has reasons for doing or allowing something that we cannot fathom. Next theodicy we're going to talk about is the soul-making theodicy. The soul-making theodicy was also made famous by John Hick and is the idea that evil and suffering exist to develop humans into virtuous creatures capable of following his will. In the words of Nietzsche and Kelly Clarkson, what doesn't kill us often makes us stronger, and the idea here is very similar. God is not simply trying to maximize our sensory pleasure, and instead wants us to practice virtue and develop as creatures capable of love. In this case, suffering can even be a good thing insofar as it has the ability to promote growth or knowledge. For instance, experiencing the pain from a consequence of a bad decision is arguably a good thing as we come to understand the why behind it. In this way, God permits evil to exist to a certain degree to promote greater goods, such as knowledge. Such greater goods are those which include the possibility of our development, hence the term soul-making, and perhaps some amount of evil and suffering is necessary for this development. For instance, Richard Swinburne argues, if there was no evil, quote, many of us would then have such an easy life that we simply would not have much opportunity to show courage, or indeed manifest much in the way of great goodness at all. We need those insidious processes of decay and dissolution, which money and strength cannot ward off for long, to give us opportunities, so easy otherwise to avoid, to become heroes. Swinburne continues by giving an example of why God may not step in to cure cancer. Quote, if God answered most prayers for a relative to recover from cancer, then cancer would no longer be a problem for humans to solve. Humans would no longer see cancer as a problem to be solved by scientific research. Prayer would be the obvious method of curing cancer. God would then have deprived us of the serious choice of whether to put money and energy into finding a cure for cancer or not to bother, and of whether to take the trouble to avoid cancer, such as by not smoking or not to bother. This theodicy dates back to Irenaeus and Origen from the 2nd and 3rd century. Origen, for instance, saw the world as a school and a hospital for our souls, with God as the teacher and doctor. Suffering, to Origen, plays an educative and healing role. Origen further suggested that all humans would eventually reach heaven, with hell referring to the purification of the sinful parts of our souls. Irenaeus saw creation as occurring in two distinct parts. One is humans being created in the image of God, while the second is humans being created in the likeness of God. To Irenaeus, this first part is complete, while the second stage is still in progress and may need to happen anew for each person. As an aside, I prefer thinking of this theodicy as God's gym theodicy. The next theodicy is the contrast theodicy, and this is best illustrated by an example. Do you enjoy food more when you're hungry or when you're full? If you answer when you're hungry, then you understand the basic idea behind the contrast theodicy, which is the idea that either God created or simply just allows evil to help us appreciate good. Some theologians believe if there was no evil or suffering, we may not look for a relationship with God, nor would we be able to appreciate the full goodness of God. In this case, the juxtaposition of God's nature with the rest of the world may drive us to want a deeper relationship with God, who is often seen as the ground of goodness itself. A related idea is often called the pain as God's megaphone theodicy, which states that God allows pain and suffering to point us towards him. In this case, evil serves a greater purpose in God's greater plan. This is compatible with different perspectives on evil, including the idea that evil itself is an illusion, or the idea that evil exists as part of why this world is the best of all possible worlds. In the words of theologian John Yoder, quote, God permits human evil to keep itself under control by using evil against itself. The Heaven Swan theodicy claims that the eternity of heaven easily outweighs whatever finite evil exists on this earth. Thomas Aquinas famously made this argument, though it is often combined with Blaise Pascal's ideas on probability. According to Pascal, there is an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, which you stake is finite. In other words, any evil experience on earth will only be experienced for a finite duration, while heaven, which is eternal, thus contains infinite good. The idea here is if God permits the existence of some evil, this evil is nothing compared to the overall good, all things considered. Many times when this is invoked, people will quote from the Bible, such as Revelation 21:4, quote, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Of course, the atheist can turn this into an argument against God by arguing the evils of hell outweigh God's good nature. At this point, the theist has several options. One is to argue that the eternal punishment for sin is not truly evil. In this view, sin is evil, while God allowing people to experience their consequence of choosing it is not. Alternatively, many will suggest that hell is simply eternal separation from God, which God reluctantly grants to people who reject him. For instance, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that hell is, quote, the state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed. Regardless, this theodicy is best paired in tandem with other theodicies. Lastly, we're going to talk about turning the tables. This theodicy uses our recognition of evil to imply that a standard for good exists. It turns the tables on the problem of evil by arguing God must exist for us to recognize evil in the first place. In effect, it says that the problem of evil is self-defeating as an argument against God. This starts by arguing if God did not exist, then no standard for good and evil exists, and therefore there is no problem of evil. On the other hand, it claims if there is genuine evil, then God must exist to know this fact, since moral ontology and moral epistemology are both contingent upon God's existence. This theodicy claims that the problem of evil is with the problem of evil itself, claiming that there's a contradiction between two premises, the one of God existing and evil existing, that are logically connected. In other words, trying to use the existence of evil to disprove the existence of God is like sawing off the branch you're sitting on. If there is no God, there is no standard of good, and thus evil is no longer a coherent concept, which makes the argument self-defeating. Writer and literary scholar C.S. Lewis famously made this argument, quote, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for my argument depended on saying that the world really was unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fantasies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Lewis concluded that, quote, conscience reveals to us a moral law whose source cannot be found in the natural world, thus pointing to a supernatural lawgiver. Some argue that this theodicy misses the point, that the problem of evil is simply an internal critique of theism. Defenders of the turning the tables argument are going to basically say this is misleading, as the problem of evil is often given as an argument for atheism, not posed as an internal critique, and there cannot be an internal critique of theism in this way if moral epistemology itself, meaning how we know things to be right or wrong, is contingent upon God's existence. Throughout this video, I've tried to give an overview of 10 popular Christian theodicies. In the case that a single theodicy fails to provide a satisfactory result, perhaps a cumulative case can be made by taking ideas from various theodicies to tackle the apparent pervasiveness and diversity of evil we see. Regardless, these theodicies are a response to the intellectual problem of evil, and for someone experiencing suffering, such a response may seem cold and uncaring. For those dealing with suffering, perhaps it is our support and comfort they need more than the logical defenses offered by the thinkers cited here. Finally, the Christian God is not a being who is indifferent or distant to our suffering. God was willing to experience incredible suffering, humiliation, and even death for our sake through Jesus. And furthermore, God is present in our sufferings and provides us comfort through the Holy Spirit and through other believers. As believers, we are called to comfort those in need and to provide support. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 1:3-4, Paul says, quote, blessed be the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted. further explaining it is often us who are blessed by being able to help those in need just as much, if not more, than those in need are blessed by the help we are called to provide. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what your favorite theodicy is, and I'll see you in the next video.